gas hits $3.88, and it reveals who's actually losing this war in real time. 3 days after Iran hit 4 countries at once and shut down the Strait of Hormuz, gas prices should have exploded. They didn't. And that single boring number sitting at your local station is quietly telling you who's actually losing this war. I want you to hold on to that contradiction for the next 20 minutes, okay? Because here's what actually happened, hour by hour. And it doesn't match the story you'd expect. On Tuesday, July 7th, Iran's Revolutionary Guard struck commercial tankers in the Strait of Hormuz. On Wednesday, July 8th, President Trump declared the ceasefire over, and the U.S. launched a fresh round of strikes, eventually covering close to 200 targets across Iran within 2 days. Iran responded by firing on American military positions in 4 separate countries: Jordan, Kuwait, Bahrain, and Oman. Tehran formally declared the Strait of Hormuz closed until further notice. This is, by any conventional measure, one of the sharpest escalations of the entire war. And the national average price of gasoline in America, as tracked by DeRoe, sat at $3.86 a gallon. Not $4.50, not $5, $3.86, hovering right around the same $3.88 range it had already been sitting at before this specific round of attacks even started. Compare that to what happened back in May, when this same war produced a genuine, uncontested spike to $4.55 a gallon, the highest price Americans had paid in years. If Iran's strait closure and 4-country retaliation strike were landing, with anywhere near the same force as the disruptions. From just 2 months earlier, prices should have rocketed right back toward that $4.50 to $5 range. They didn't come close. And that gap between how dramatic the headlines sounded and how little the actual number at the pump moved is the single most revealing data point in this entire war right now. Because gas prices aren't just a number that annoys you at the pump. They're a live, minute-by-minute vote, cast by the entire global oil market on whether it actually believes the threats being made are real. So today, I'm going to walk through 3 competing explanations for why this specific escalation barely moved the number that's supposed to move the most whenever this exact kind of thing happens. I'm going to use nothing but real data from the U.S. Energy Information Administration, DA's own daily price tracker, trading economics, futures, market data, and reporting on the parallel energy crisis, unfolding in Russia at the exact same time. And then I'm going to show you why the real explanation isn't the war is calming down, and it isn't Americans got lucky. It's that the gas pump has become an accidental real-time scoreboard revealing which side's central threat is actually losing its power to scare anyone. 3 theories, same set of numbers. Only one framework explains all of it. Are you ready? Let's go. Before I get into the evidence, you need the 3 theories by name, because if you don't understand the categories, you can't judge the evidence properly, okay? Theory number 1 is what I'll call the consumer casualty theory. This says the real story here is simple. Americans are the ones losing, full stop, paying 20% more for gas than a year ago, no matter what's happening geopolitically. And that's the entire story worth telling. Theory number 2 is what I'll call the market fatigue theory. This says traders and markets have simply grown numb to this specific war after months of on and off strikes. And prices are staying calm purely out of habituation, not because anything strategically meaningful has actually shifted. And theory number 3, the one I'm going to build for you today, I call the fading leverage signal. This says the muted price reaction isn't fatigue at all. It's the market delivering a specific, measurable verdict that Iran's central warfighting strategy, using the threat of closing the Strait of Hormuz to hold 1/5 of the world's oil supply hostage, is losing its actual coercive power in real time, and the gas price chart is the clearest evidence. We have that this is happening. Let's take them one at a time. Theory 1, the consumer casualty. I want to be fair to this theory first, because the underlying pain is real and well documented. Here's the strongest version of the case. According to LendingTree's analysis of 802A data, the national average gas price hit $3.79 a gallon on July 7th, up 20.5% from $3.14 a year earlier. Nearly every single state recorded double-digit percentage increases over that same 12-month window, with only Indiana bucking the trend, thanks specifically to a temporary suspension of its state gas tax. Hawaii sat at $5.46 a gallon, California at $5.37, Washington at $5.02. Even the cheapest states in the country, Indiana at $3.06, Oklahoma and Texas at $3.32, were still meaningfully higher than where they'd been sitting before this war began back in late February, when the national average was just $2.96. The monthly EIA data tells the same story from a different angle. June 2026's average price came in at $4.05 a gallon, which tied June 2008 for the 9th highest monthly average on record. That's not a minor inconvenience. That's one of the most expensive months for gasoline in American history, driven directly by a war most drivers have no personal stake in and very little control over. Regardless of who's winning or losing on any given battlefield, the argument goes, it's the person filling up their tank in Ohio or Arizona who's actually absorbing the cost week after week, month after month. That's a real, sympathetic, well-supported argument, and I don't want to dismiss the genuine financial pain millions of households are feeling right now. This isn't a story where nobody actually loses. But here's the problem, and this is the single most important question in this entire video, okay? So pay attention to this one. If gas prices simply track the intensity of the war in a straightforward way, why did the national average keep falling from $4.48 in May to $4.05 in June to $3.83 by early July, during a period when the war didn't actually end, and then barely twitch upward? Even after a dramatic new round of escalation involving strikes on 4 separate countries and a formally declared closure of the Strait of Hormuz, think about that gap carefully. If the consumers are simply victims of an ongoing war theory, we're the complete picture. The price chart should track the war's intensity like a mirror, up when things get worse, down when things calm down. Instead, prices kept declining through an active war, and then largely shrugged off one of its sharpest escalations. Something else is happening underneath the raw pain consumers are still genuinely feeling, and it's visible directly in how little that pain actually responded to what should have been a major shock. Theory 2, the market fatigue. This is a reasonable middle theory, and plenty of traders would tell you this is exactly what's happening. Let me lay out the strongest version before I build my own synthesis on top of it. According to Trading Economics' own market commentary, after Trump announced plans to restore a full blockade on Iranian vessels and impose a 20% charge on all other cargo using the strait, U.S. gasoline futures did rise, but only to around $3.20 a gallon, described directly as their highest level in 7 weeks. 7 weeks. Not a new all-time high, not even close to May's $4.55 peak, just a modest bump, back to where prices had already been sitting roughly a month and a half earlier. And within days, by July 13th, those same futures had already fallen back toward $3 a gallon, even as Iran was actively targeting U.S. facilities in Jordan, Kuwait, Bahrain, and Oman. And Tehran was formally declaring the strait closed. One plausible read here is straightforward market fatigue. This war has now been running on and off since February 28th. Traders have watched multiple rounds of strikes, multiple ceasefires, multiple "the deal is over" declarations, multiple partial strait closures. After enough cycles of dramatic headlines followed by markets recovering within days, professional traders may simply be pricing in an assumption that this specific pattern, escalate, strike, threaten the strait, then quietly de-escalate again, is now the war's permanent rhythm and adjusting their risk models accordingly. Under this theory, the muted price reaction isn't a signal about Iran specifically, it's just what happens to any market after being cried wolf at enough times. Eventually, the alarm itself stops moving the needle, regardless of whether the underlying threat has actually changed. That's a coherent explanation, and it fits the general pattern of how commodity markets tend to behave after repeated similar shocks. Diminishing returns on shock value is a real, well-documented phenomenon in trading behavior. But this theory has a specific weakness worth examining closely, and it's the same weakness that pushes us toward a more precise explanation. Fatigue alone doesn't explain why Central Command specifically stated that commercial vessels could continue lawfully transiting the strait, directly contradicting Tehran's own declaration that the waterway was closed. Fatigue doesn't explain why laden tankers from the UAE kept loading and sailing during the exact window Iran claimed the strait was shut. If this were pure trader exhaustion, you'd expect confusion or hedging, not a specific, confident, on-record statement from the U.S. military that the thing Iran just declared closed was, in practical terms, still open for business. The data, what actually happened, week by week. Now let me give you the actual granular timeline, because theory without data is just storytelling. And I want you to be able to verify every piece of this yourself, since this is the section that reveals which theory the numbers actually support. Before this war began, on February 26, 2026, the national average gas price sat at $2.96 a gallon, roughly 5% lower than the same week in 2025. That's worth remembering because it establishes the real baseline this entire war has been measured against. 2 days later, on February 28th, the war began, and the Strait of Hormuz effectively became a contested waterway for the first time in this conflict. Gas prices climbed steadily and sharply from that baseline, eventually peaking at $4.55 a gallon on May 21st, a jump of roughly 54% above the pre-war price. That May peak is the moment the consumer casualty and war intensity tracks price theories both predict should keep repeating every time the war escalates again. Instead, look at what happened next. Through June, prices fell to a monthly average of $4.05. By July 4th, AAA reported the national average had dropped to $3.83 a gallon, nearly 50 cents below where it had been just a month earlier, explicitly described in Huawei's own release as relief at the pump. Even though the underlying war had not actually ended, it had simply entered a quieter phase of ongoing negotiation. Crude oil prices during that same window had fallen to some of their lowest levels of the year, with West Texas Intermediate settling around $68.58 a barrel, and U.S. crude inventories sitting about 7% below their 5-year seasonal average, still not catastrophically tight by historical standards. Then came the second week of July, and the sequence that should have shattered that calm. On July 6th and 7th, Iranian forces struck multiple commercial tankers in the Strait. On July 8th, at the NATO summit in Ankara, Trump declared the ceasefire over, and within hours, the U.S. launched close to 200 strikes across Iranian territory over the following 2 days. Iran fired back at American military installations in Jordan, Kuwait, Bahrain, and Oman, the broadest simultaneous multi-country retaliation of the entire war. Tehran formally announced the strait was closed until further notice. Trump separately floated, reinstating a full naval blockade on Iranian vessels and imposing a 20% transit charge on all other cargo using the waterway. And the actual price response to all of that was this. Gasoline futures rose to roughly $3.20 a gallon, a 7-week high. Not a new record, not even close to the May peak. And the national average at the pump sat at $3.86 on July 9th, virtually unchanged from the $3.87 recorded the week before any of this specific escalation even happened. By July 13th and 14th, futures had already eased back down toward the $3 to $3.24 range, with trading economics explicitly attributing the retreat to continued technical negotiations between the U.S. and Iran persisting despite the renewed hostilities, alongside U.S. Central Command's own statement that commercial vessels could continue lawfully transiting the strait, directly undercutting Tehran's own closure declaration. Investors, according to that same reporting, expected the waterway to remain functionally open, and selected laden tankers from the UAE kept loading and sailing throughout the exact window Iran claimed the passage was shut. Meanwhile, a genuinely separate crisis was unfolding at the exact same time, and it matters enormously for understanding the full picture. Ukraine intensified drone strikes on Russian energy infrastructure, targeting oil depots in Russia's Stavropol region and storage facilities at the port of Kavkaz, specifically aimed at disrupting Moscow's ability to fund its own war. Russian gasoline production collapsed to roughly 65% of seasonal average consumption, forcing major refineries to suspend operations entirely, and Russia responded by banning gasoline exports outright to preserve domestic supply. Separately, Kazakhstan's Caspian Pipeline Consortium reported a 7% decline in June shipments, driven by scheduled maintenance at the Tengiz oil field and reduced Russian flows through the same pipeline network. And offsetting all of this pressure from the supply side, OPEC Plus had been raising output throughout this period, creating what analysts described as a looming crude supply glut, even as questions remained about whether global refining capacity could actually absorb that additional supply efficiently. Theory 3, the fading leverage signal. Now let me put it all together, because this is where the real explanation lives, and it requires understanding something crucial about what the Strait of Hormuz actually represents strategically for Iran, and what happens to a threat once the market stops believing it will actually be carried out at full force. Here's the core idea. Iran's entire coercive leverage in this war has never really rested on its conventional military strength, which analysts widely agree cannot match the combined force of the U.S. and Israeli militaries. Its leverage has always rested on a single, specific threat: the credible possibility that it could meaningfully disrupt roughly a fifth of the world's oil supply by targeting shipping through the Strait of Hormuz. That threat only works, strategically, if the rest of the world genuinely believes Iran both can and will follow through on it at a scale severe enough to actually matter. The moment global oil markets start pricing in the assumption that any given round of strait disruption will be partial, survivable, and quickly absorbed, that threat stops functioning as real leverage and starts functioning as background noise. Look again at the actual sequence of numbers. In late February and into May, when this specific coercive threat was still new and unproven, the market reacted with real, sustained fear, pushing prices up 54% above the pre-war baseline. That's what a credible, still untested threat does to a market. It forces in a large risk premium because nobody yet knows how bad this could actually get. But by July, after months of watching Iran repeatedly threaten the strait, periodically strike ships, and periodically declare closures while global oil actually kept moving, UAE tankers loading and sailing, OPEC Plus raising output to cover any gaps, U.S. Central Command explicitly confirming lawful transit, continuing even during a declared closure, The market had accumulated enough real, observable data to conclude that Iran's threat, however loud, was not translating into the kind of sustained, severe supply shock that would justify pricing gas back toward $4.50 or $5 a gallon. The muted price reaction in July isn't fatigue in the vague sense Theory 2 describes. It's a specific calculable judgment made collectively by traders, insurers, and shippers that Iran's central strategic weapon has been tested repeatedly now and repeatedly found to fall short of full execution. This is precisely why the parallel Russia story matters so much for understanding what's actually driving fuel prices globally right now. Russia's refineries, hit by a sustained, deliberate Ukrainian drone campaign, actually dropped to 65% of seasonal production capacity, a far more severe, measurable degradation than anything the Strait disruptions produced, and Russia's response was to ban its own gasoline exports entirely, an admission of real supply crisis, not political theater. If you're looking for a supply shock genuinely reshaping global fuel markets in real time this month, it's not coming primarily from Iran's declared strait closure, which the market treated as background noise. It's coming from a separate war, where the disruption to actual refining capacity was severe enough that Russia had to formally restrict its own exports to cope. Iran declared its choke point closed and tankers kept sailing anyway. Russia's refineries got hit hard enough that the country stopped exporting fuel altogether. That contrast, sitting side by side in the same week's data, is the clearest possible answer to the question in this video's title. That's the fading leverage signal. Gas prices at $3.86 to $3.88 a gallon, essentially flat, despite a dramatic four-country Iranian retaliation and a declared strait closure, aren't evidence that nobody's losing this war. They're evidence that Iran's central warfighting leverage, the credible threat of choking off a fifth of the world's oil supply, has been tested enough times now that the global market no longer prices it as an existential risk. The side actually losing in real time, measured by the market's own verdict, isn't the American consumer, who is still paying real elevated prices, and it isn't obviously the US militarily either. It's Iran's own coercive strategy, which built its entire wartime power on a threat that the market has now, through months of repeated testing, learned to substantially discount. 3 things to watch for in the next 30 days. All right, we're almost at the end, and I want to give you 3 specific things to track, because this is how you test a theory like this. You make predictions and see if the evidence matches. Prediction number 1. Watch whether gasoline futures and the national average continue to shrug off future Iranian strait threats with smaller and smaller price reactions each time. If the fading leverage theory holds, expect each subsequent Iranian escalation around the strait to produce a progressively weaker market response than the one before it, the opposite of what you'd expect if Iran's threat were becoming more credible over time. Prediction number 2. Watch whether U.S. Central Command continues issuing direct on-record statements confirming commercial shipping. Can transit the strait, specifically timed to counter Iranian closure declarations. If this becomes a repeated pattern, it's a clear sign Washington itself understands that publicly undercutting Tehran's stated leverage is now a deliberate part of its own strategy to keep global energy markets calm. Prediction number 3. Watch the Russia-Ukraine energy story alongside the Iran story, not separately. If Ukraine's drone campaign against Russian refineries continues producing sharper, more measurable disruptions than anything coming out of the Strait of Hormuz, expect global energy analysts to increasingly treat the Russia-Ukraine front, not the Iran-Israel-US front, as the more consequential driver of actual fuel price movements going forward. Here's your homework, and I mean this seriously. I want you to go find AOA's actual daily price data for the week surrounding May 21st, when prices peaked at $4.55, and then compare it directly to the week surrounding July 8th, when Iran hit 4 countries at once and declared the strait closed. Line up the percentage change in each case. Ask yourself honestly whether a war getting more dangerous should produce a smaller market reaction the second and third time around, or whether that pattern only makes sense if the underlying threat itself has lost credibility. If you find something that contradicts what I've laid out today, come argue with me in the comments. I mean that. I'm not asking you to agree with me. I'm asking you to look at the same numbers and ask a harder question than, why is gas expensive? The question worth asking is this. When a country's entire war strategy depends on the rest of the world believing a specific threat, and that threat keeps producing smaller and smaller reactions every single time it's actually carried out, what does that pattern tell you about who's winning the war of credibility, even while the shooting war continues? Sit with that question. Look at the numbers. We covered today the $2.96 baseline, the $4.55 peak, the $3.83 relief, the flat $3.86. Despite 4 countries getting struck, Russia's actual refinery collapse sitting right next to it. And I think you'll start to notice something the price at your local pump was never designed to announce out loud, but has been quietly revealing the entire time. I'll see you in the next one.